Good afternoon or good evening as it applies. Welcome to Open Classroom. I'm Janet Gillow, the Director of Professional Development for the Brown School here at Washington University in St. Louis. Thank you so much for joining us for today's program. For those of you joining on the Zoom webinar, we can't see or hear you, but we do want to hear from you. The chat feature is enabled, and we would love to have your questions and comments as we go. We are also live streaming on YouTube. I want to say a special hello to guests joining us that way, and that we are not able to moderate chat. Closed captioning is enabled, and we will have ASL interpretation throughout this presentation. Before getting started today, I just want to let you know what we have coming up next week. 2 different programs, 2 different Brown School alumnus. On Tuesday, October 5th, Associate Professor Lorian Carter is delivering a program on what's happening in the teenage brain and why does it matter. That's a special 90-minute program made possible by Catholic Charities of St. Louis. And then we're back on Thursday, October 7th. Electa Hare Redcorn is delivering a presentation called Parry in Perpetuity, Peeling Back the Layers of Agricultural Policy in a Prayerful Way. That's part of the 2021 Indigenous Knowledge and Sustainability Conference. Our own Catherine M. Buter Center is a sponsor of that conference, and Electa, as a Brown School alum, is going to be presenting. Those are free, open, share them with friends. We would love to have you back. But now it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jean-Francois Trani. He's my partner in developing the Inclusive Perspectives series. Jean-Francois is Associate Professor of Public Health, Chair of our Global Health Specialization. He's going to moderate the Q&A today. So please welcome Jean-Francois.
Thank you so much, Janet. Thank you, everyone, for coming to our Inclusive Perspective series. Today, I have the great pleasure to welcome Professor Susanne Bruyere, a psychologist by training and one of the main world leader experts on disability studies and employment. So it's a privilege to have you, Susanne, with us today. Susanne Bruyere is a professor of disability studies and the director of the K. Lisa Young and Ock Heighten Institute on Employment and Disability at Cornell University School. She's also the editor of Disability and Employer Practices. Dr. Bruyere has served as project director and co-principal investigator in numerous federally sponsored research, dissemination, technical assistant efforts focused on employment and disability policy and effective workplace practices for people with disabilities. Finally, Professor Bruyere's research focus is to identify facilitators to full inclusion of individuals with disabilities in the workforce and the workplace. And I'm sure we will learn a lot for our community to promote inclusion in employment for persons with disabilities. So without more time, thank you so much once again, and the floor is yours, Professor Bruyere.
Thank you very much. And I will move to my slides. I'm very grateful to our colleagues for that introduction, but more so for this opportunity to share our work at the Yang Tan Institute at Cornell University with people who have joined us here today. So thank you to Washington University Brown School and my colleagues there, Jean-Francois and Janet, for helping to facilitate this opportunity. I have quite a bit of material to share with you, so I'm going to go fairly quickly, but be assured you are welcome to these slides, and there are resources at the end. For my contribution to this wonderful series that you're having, I am going to focus on workplace disability inclusion, employment and disability, and getting people to work who are people with disabilities has been the focus of our work here at Cornell for many, many years now. And I'm going to talk about the business case for diversity and inclusion to sort of broaden this why disability, why a focus on inclusion. It really fits in the heart of the, I'd say, renewed, reawoken emphasis right now on inclusion that is such a critical part of what we're needing to experience in the US and globally. And so to me, disability inclusion is a critical part of that conversation, and employment is where I'd like to focus. So in my time with you today, I'm going to talk about why disability should be a part of diversity considerations, and I'll make the point through sharing information about prevalence rates, disparities we see, and opportunities that are emerging. Why it's important to business, because I do think there is an economic reason for us, not just a social justice reason, to be having this conversation. What employees with disabilities are telling us about current workplace climate and disability inclusion from some research that we have done, what we know to be good practices in disability inclusion. And I'm going to particularly talk about a couple of things around that climate for inclusion conversation, and that is the criticality of a supervisor's role in building an environment where a person in the workplace can thrive, and how important it is for people to feel comfortable coming forward, asking for accommodations, and therefore self-identifying as a person with a disability. And I will leave you with lots of resources that we have from our research, many of which are available online, free resources. So with that, I want to start with who are people with disabilities and why is this a population that we should be concerned about? So I'm going to start with a question to you all, and that is, how many households have a member with a disability living with them? And I don't think we can probably get input in a timely way from our participants. 83, it looks like 83 participants right now, but I will just have you stop and think. Would you say 1, 6%, 2, 8%, 3, 15%, or 4, 24%? I'd be very curious to know amongst our participants where you would land on those 4 options. And the question is important because indeed the answer is number 4. 24% of American households have an individual with a disability living in that household. And that's critically important, I think, because it both gives you an idea, and we're going to talk more about prevalence rates in just a moment, about how many people with disabilities there are. But we talk about it in terms of households because that there's a multiplier in that, a multiplier of impact of disability. When you're looking at households, the impact is much more significant. And when I talk to employers about the importance of disability, and they might see 10 or 11% of working age people with disabilities, it may sound to them that's not a great number to be concerned about, or they may tell me, I have no one in my workplace with a disability, I don't need to worry about accommodations. And the reality of it is at least a quarter of their workforce is impacted in some way about disability. They may have a spouse, a child, and a parent, a family member that they're concerned about, and seeing an employer proactively deal with workplace inclusion looks positive to this quarter of your workforce because they personally understand how difficult it might be, and seeing employers proactively try to mitigate some of the discrimination and difficulty people have getting into the workplace is a positive persuader for them that they're in the right place, working for the right employer. So how common is disability? Prevalence rates for disability, we can get them by age, gender, race, and type of disability, and they can be obtained from a variety of surveys. We often use the American Community Survey that seems to have the most robust data from American Census Work, Bureau of Labor Statistics and Census Work. So that is what we use. And from that, I can tell you that in our most recent poll, we are always a couple years behind because the census data doesn't release their data in a timely way. They take time to make sure it's accurate. Now they've just released 2019, so 2018 was our most recent. And in that number, I had mentioned that it's a 10 to 11% prevalence rate of people with disabilities in the US population who are working age. And working age is narrowly defined here from 21 to 64. It certainly could be broader. We choose 21 because we are looking to find out once people exit college. If we look earlier than that, sometimes people are not in the workforce because of college. And so we mitigate that potential misperception with that threshold on the lower end of the age spectrum, and 64 on the higher end of the age spectrum, which is actually much older now. This is a more traditional age use because of retirement opportunities at 65. But indeed, people are working longer, which I also will talk about in a moment. So how do people with disabilities, we just talked about the prevalence rates, fare economically compared to their non-disabled peers? And I am building this business case for us. So 1 in 10 working age people, or a little bit more, are available to us in the working age population. And we know that people with disabilities need an opportunity to participate because they're much less likely to be employed and far more likely to live in poverty. This is true globally. It is not just true for us in the US, but I'm using US data, so I will reference the US when I talk about this. And here are some of our disparities up close. Again, we're talking about the same age group, 21 to 64. So the employment rate of people with disabilities in the US is about 38% compared to about almost 80% for people without disabilities. So a huge gap, almost a 42% gap of the available people in this working age group in the United States with and without disabilities. So a significant participation, labor force participation gap for people with disabilities. That's unused talent in the US. And unfortunately, the subsequent impact of that is that people with disabilities have significantly lower median annual household incomes in this age cohort. People with disabilities on average make about almost 47,000, have as a household income about $47,000 compared to over $74,000. So a gap of $27,500 in median annual household income. So disability has a significant impact on the earning power of a household when there's a person with a disability. That results in a significantly higher poverty rate for people with disabilities in the US, and that is a gap of 16%. People with disabilities on average 26% under the poverty line compared to 10% of people without disabilities. And again, this is pre-pandemic data, but it has been true. These kinds of disparities have been true for many, many years. So with this backdrop, why might disability be of importance to employers? We know there's a lot of people. There's actually 1 billion people globally, 15% of the world's population, 11% of the working age population in the United States, underemployed, higher representation, disparately so, in the poverty line. And for employers, this is of concern because it is an expanded talent pool at little or no additional cost and equal performance. So there's a huge cohort of people who could be absorbed in our labor force in many of the places that we are looking for people to employ. We know from experience with diverse work groups comes increased innovation and creativity, and that is true for integrating people with disabilities into your workplace as well. So there's expanded innovation, improved group performance, and that's if managers are well trained and know how to integrate previously underrepresented people or diverse people in their workforce. So it's really important that those diverse work cohorts are managed well to realize these creative and innovative contributions that people can make. But that is certainly another contribution individuals with disabilities make to the workplace. Fulfillment of executive and legislative mandates. So many of our countries, the US included, have employment non-discrimination for people with disabilities provisions. For us, it's the Americans with Disabilities Act. There are many countries that have disability employment discrimination legislation now, and the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities since 2008 has had certainly a provision on this. So we are globally under this umbrella of scrutiny looking at the importance of equitable integration for people with disabilities into the workforce. I say that, but I don't think that that is the only reason that why businesses should be concerned about this. Just responding to legislative mandates is not sufficient to really build a workplace disability inclusive culture. So we need to think about it as a strategic business imperative, which is why I lead with the comment about the talent pool. It's also important for us, particularly in the US, but many other Western countries as well, to consider this because we have an aging workforce and we have veterans returning with disabilities and need to be able to understand how to build a workplace culture infrastructure that can support them and keep them in the workplace. For some smaller companies, there are tax incentives that are good reasons to hire because you can be advantaged that way. And we know if you have a quarter of the American population who have a person with a disability in their household, there is a market share to be had there for not only the individuals with wealth who are persons with disabilities, but household members who want to do things with their loved ones, their household member who's a person with a disability. And if they can't get into that restaurant, they will not participate in that place to go out when they're wanting to go out with their family. So those are things to think about as a business of why include people with disabilities. I have one example. There are now, it's fortunately increasing numbers of affirmative hiring programs, but one that's been quite high profile in the last 5 or 6 years is an interest in affirmative hiring of neurodiverse talent in their effort to look for new talent pools to fill the many jobs that are burgeoning in the computer sector and computer intensive sectors. There's been a marked interest in the unique characteristics of focus and attention to detail and ability to see patterns of many autistic individuals. And the leadership in this area has come from a number of nonprofits, one being Specialist Sterne from Denmark, and many select companies, Hewlett Packard, which now is a subsidiary, DXC Technology, which has been a leader in this area, SAP, Microsoft, JP Morgan Chase, EY. There are now many other companies that are jumping on board. If you have an interest in this, I think there's now something like over 30 companies who have joined the Autism at Work Roundtable that's being sponsored by Disability In, an American organization that is a membership association of companies that are doing affirmative hiring, affirmative good practice around workplace disability inclusion, and you can find out more about it there. So I talked about the aging workforce. I'm going to just share these statistics with you so that I can confirm with you that this is something for us as employers to think about, employers, service providers, because indeed more people are wanting to stay in beyond retirement age of 60, traditional retirement age of 65 in the workplace. And it's predicted that between 2014 and 2024, we're almost there, the number of workers 55 years and older would grow by 20% in that 10-year period. And that the bulk of that growth would be made up of people older than 65. And many people, this baby boom generation continues to age. The number of 65 to 74-year-olds in the labor force is projected to increase more than workers in any other age group, and workers age 75 and older are expected to have the fastest growth of all. Many people are wanting to stay with the workforce because they feel that they have the interest, the good health, perhaps a need for financial income, but for many it's engagement in their workplace, engagement in their communities, and they feel that's a good way to do it. The Social Security Administration projects that by 2080, 23% of the total population will be age 65 and older, and the general working age population will shrink to 54%. And why this is important and relevant to this conversation is because the prevalence of disability does grow with age statistically, We can see the difference between the year 2000 and the year 2010 in terms of the proportion of people in the workforce who are in this older age cohort, significantly greater. And prevalence rate of disability, as you can see here, about a quarter of people in the 65 to 70, statistically 65 to 74-year-old group have some kind of disability, and it increases after 75 on average to almost 50%. So some kind of limitation or disability. It might be mobility, hearing impairment, visual impairment, or chronic health condition. We're getting better, fortunately, with our healthcare. We're mitigating many of these things, but it is there. It's something for employers to think about, and having a workplace that is proactively accommodating means you can retain workers and keep them productive much longer. So that headset's really important to creating a disability-friendly, disability-inclusive workplace. A little bit about the veterans. I mentioned veteran inclusion is an important part of these considerations. In the United States, about a quarter of our veterans returning from conflict, unfortunately, are people who are impacted with a disability. There are ratings around that. Many of these people want to return to the American workforce when they come back, and so it's really important for us to be prepared to be able to accommodate and proactively include them. I mentioned this about a quarter of the workforce. This would suggest this statistic, about 28% or 2.4 million returning veterans in this working age cohort who have a service-connected disability that we want to reabsorb into the workforce. So we need to be prepared for that. One of the ways I'm going to now move from business case to the fact that that we know there are disparities. There are disparities certainly in workplace participation, workforce participation, but also we know that once people get into the workforce or trying to get into the workforce, they experience discrimination. One of the places we look as researchers to understand what it is that might be happening that are precluding people is using the administrative data sets from the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that has a employment disability discrimination charge data set. We obtain an Interagency Personnel Act agreement to be able to access this data. And right now we have data from 1993 to 2014. We are going to probably get another pull of data. We've just not done that yet. But the thing that this has allowed us to do, they have been fairly consistent, except for one anomaly I'm going to talk about, across since the ADA passed in 1990, it started, and the employment provision started in 1992. The first full year is 1993. As we can look at trends over time in both the types of disabilities that people were filing discrimination charges on, as well as the part of the employment process, and we compare it to race, gender, and age disability. So we can take a look at, do people with disabilities experience discrimination differently? Just some examples of some data that we can pull from that. We look at most common issues, and these are the reasons for making charges. And as you see here, no surprise, 3 out of 5 people, and this is true for other forms of discrimination as well, that more likely it's in the discharge area, people feeling like they've been pushed out because of their characteristic, their diverse characteristic, and that's true for people with disabilities. The second most common is not the employer being perceived to not accommodate. Terms and conditions, only 1 in 5. Harassment and discipline might be a culture, workplace inclusion kind of issue. That's, if you sum them, 25%. Hiring is far less. That doesn't mean that that's not a place where discrimination is occurring, but it's very difficult for a person who's applying for a job to prove discrimination because they have so little comparative data to base that judgment on. So that's why I think, and many of us feel that that's why we don't see higher numbers there. The bases, the disability types that people are filing charges on. And again, I share this with employers to say you should think about your employment processes. Are you pushing people who are older, veterans, have disabilities, known health condition problems out of the workplace in disproportionate ways from your non-disabled people? That's what people are perceiving and why they're filing charges. And then we also talk to them about, here are the types of disabilities that people are filing charges on. And that's informative for them, because are there things you could be doing to proactively accommodate these individuals? We see 15% are orthopedic issues. So that might be path of travel. It might be mobility considerations like parking access. So there are things that I'm hoping employers think about when we bring this to them. That's our purpose in it. And here you see anxiety disorders and depression, about 10% of these highest charges. There are many more different charges. These are the most predominant ones. And then the other three could be perceived to be conditions that are exacerbated in the aging process. That's diabetes, heart, cardiovascular cancer. To me, a composite of almost 10, 11%. A compelling reason to have wellness programs, proactive, healthy, keep your workforce healthy types of programs, and accommodations for these types of disabilities, because people are feeling that their rights are somehow being violated. And that's why they're filing employment discrimination charges. I mentioned that we pretty much look, and there are similarities across these whole 30 years that we've been looking at this data. But there is an exception, and the exception follows around the time when Americans with Disabilities Act was amended to be more inclusive, and more people with non-obvious disabilities were considered included, or people who had medications or other treatment mitigations of the symptoms or the full impact of that disability, and where they were previously being considered not protected. These amendments heightened those protections. And so people felt, we feel, more emboldened to come forward. What's interesting about this is not only were more charges being filed, but the bulk of these, 4 out of 5 of the non-obvious disabilities that we took a look at, are in the mental health area. So I think this is another thing we talk to employers about, is mental health is a huge thing to proactively educate your workforce and provide supports in your workplace to support people, because they obviously have not felt like they've been dealt with fairly in the workplace. So that's the subsequent result are these increase in charges. Mental health, I talked about, and I'll just do a little drill down here. Mental health bases that are being filed. This again is over a shorter window, a 10-year window from 2005 to 2014, but you can see the bulk of these are on depression and anxiety. But there is also some more significant disability, mental health related disabilities here, manic depression, other psychiatric disorders, PTSD, schizophrenia as well. And when we look at the issues underneath these mental health related disabilities, again, we see that they very much track the generic disability related profile, people with disabilities, with mental health disabilities feeling like they're being pushed out of the workplace. So discharge, alleged unlawful discharge or disparate treatment discharge. Reasonable accommodations follows, terms and conditions, harassment, discipline, and constructive discharge, the least there. So I'm going to move from here is who people with disabilities are, and why we're focusing on them, because of their lesser ability to be in the workforce, and how discrimination may be occurring in the workplace, to what can we proactively do to mitigate these disparities. So we have on numerous occasions over the last 20 years worked closely with the Society for Human Resource Management, which is a membership organization of HR professionals in the US. About 350,000 of them, At this time, there were about 250,000. This survey now is about 6 or 7 years ago. And we interviewed and surveyed about 2,000 or 3,000. We had a 23% response rate, or 662. And we looked at recruitment, accessibility, retention, advancement, barriers, metrics, and trainings. And I'm just going to give you a little snapshot of what HR professionals told us they were doing. And it also gives us a chance to look at what are known good practices. So we looked at what are known good practices in recruitment and hiring from prior research and from the literature more broadly. And we found out that 3 out of 5 of these respondents had persons with disabilities and diversity and inclusions plans, which is great, but that's minimum. It should be in all of them. A little more than half had relationships with community organizations that sourced talent on people with disabilities for them to apply to their jobs. A little less said that they were actively recruiting people with disabilities, only 45%. A little more than a third reported that they had strong senior management commitment for affirmatively hiring people with disabilities. About a quarter said that they used tax incentives, and partly that is because it's really, most tax incentives are pitched to smaller businesses. About a quarter said that they reported having explicit goals, organizational goals, strategic goals, including issues, either hiring or retention, advancement, inclusion of people with disabilities. 1 in 5 had internships for people with disabilities, and less than 1 in 5, 17% said that they had persons with disabilities considerations in management performance. So that is holding supervisors accountable for inclusion, affirmative hiring, et cetera, and leadership more broadly. So does it make a difference? Do these, they told us what they did. The other thing we wanted to find out, if this is what they're doing, that's informative, of course, but does it make, which of these, if any, make a difference in terms of affirmative hiring? So we also asked these companies, were they affirmatively hiring people with disabilities? And we found that after adjusting for organizational characteristics like industry and size, each of these practices I just shared with you significantly increased the likelihood of hiring an individual with disability. So they do matter, and they, different of them, of each of these matters more. We found that targeted internships increase the likelihood that the company would have hired in the last year by 6 times, strong senior management commitment by 5 times, explicit organizational goals by 4 times, and active recruitment, screening, interviewing, including disability and diversity and inclusion plans, and relationships with employment community service providers all enhance the likelihood of a successful outcome of hiring people with disabilities in the last year by 3 times. So these good practices definitely do make a difference in increasing the likelihood that you'll get people with disabilities into the workplace. So start with internship programs. When companies say, what can I do? I always say, this is the easiest win. Or get an executive champion passionate about issues around inclusion and neurodiversity or disability more generally. And when we know that our workforce has 1 in 4 households has a person with a disability, it probably won't be hard to find those champions who either have a personal experience or are an ally. Set concrete recruitment and hiring goals as a part of the business strategy. Message about affirmative interest to recruit is really important, both inside your organization and external to the organization, so the community knows that you're affirmatively hiring. Align with a community partner who can source qualified candidates and support company efforts, and spread the word and build internal allies. They are there. That personal experience is a quarter of your workforce. We also asked about career development and advancement because we have focused for years on getting people into the workplace and not done as equitably focused a job looking at what happens to them once they get there. And in our inquiry, we have found that indeed people feel like they get into their job, they're excited about it, and then they get stuck. So we asked these HR professionals, this is again going back to that informant, what they have been doing. And we found that 3/4 of them had a return to work or disability management program for employees who are ill, injured, or become disabled, which is great. Having those programs mean that people who often incur a disability or health condition issue are supported in the return to work process, but it also means that that workplace is more likely to be familiar with the accommodation process, which benefits all people with disabilities. We found about 3 out of 5 had flexible work arrangements for all employees, and that's very helpful to employees with disabilities when they need it, like flex time, part-time, telecommuting. We have been doing that in spades for the last 18 months since the pandemic has hit us. We found out we can do this pretty well. 2 out of 5 invites employees to confidentially disclose whether they have a disability. Less than 1 in 5 has structured mentoring program to support employees with disabilities, or career planning and development tools, or a disability-focused employee network, or explicit goals related to retention and advancement for people with disabilities. And the least, only less than 1 in 10, involved progress toward retention or advancement goals for employees with disabilities and the performance management requirements, expectations of their supervisors. And supervisors' perceptions of what's important to them certainly are influenced by how they're held accountable. That's why that's a very important area. And we'll talk more about supervisors in a minute. So what are the important things around career development and retention? This is another element from this HR professionals. We asked them what they thought was very effective. And they said, first, having a targeted employee business network group, an ERG or BRG, very important. And yet, as you saw, a few of them have it. Having follow-along case management services for the return to work process for individuals who incur disabilities or have an accident or illness. Flexible work arrangements for all employees and targeted mentoring programs for individuals with disabilities. So they knew these are effective. They weren't necessarily doing them. There was a mismatch there. We also asked them about accommodations. And from a different study, I will just share with you that often employers will say, well, accommodations may be expensive. I don't think I can do that. I don't have it in the budget. And from the census data, US Census data, and this is from the current population survey from the different data set, we find that in a disability supplement that came out in 2012, they asked the question about were you accommodated by your employer? And 95% of the people who said yes, they had sought accommodations from their employer were individuals without disabilities. And I use this statistic liberally with employers to show them that they're accommodating all the time. They know this is good practice. It keeps their workforce healthy and happy. They feel that they have the flexibility they need to lead the lives that they're living and still be productive citizens. And it's not necessarily around a health-related issue. It's a whole variety of different things that they might need. And only 5% of these respondents were individuals with disabilities who were asking for these accommodations. Effective accommodation policies, we know, are having a centralized accommodation fund, a point person for questions, a formalized accommodation request process, internal and external resources when needed, targeted training for supervisors, embedding accommodation throughout the human resources process and the employment process, and known to extend time in job post illness and injury. That's a very easy accommodation, just giving people an extra week or 2 or a month rather than losing them to the workforce and making them feel that they're wanted to come back. So another area that's very important to us is encouraging companies to keep metrics. And unfortunately, what we consistently know from the SHRM survey, but other work that we've done, is that far fewer metrics are kept for individuals with disabilities than for other underrepresented populations, such as gender, race, ethnicity. So in our inquiry, again, with the Society for Human Resource Management, we found that little less than a third keep data on accommodations, but that was the most often kept statistic. Little fewer kept number of job applicants. About a quarter kept the number of job applicants hired. About a little less than that kept the number of job applicants. Less than 1 in 5 looked at employee retention and advancement, kept that kind of data. Or grievances from employees with disabilities. Only 14% looked at compensation equity. About 1 in 10 looked at turnover rates for people with disabilities, which will tell you a lot. If they are turning over in greater proportion, it's a high likelihood that you have a problem with workplace disability inclusion. So that's why these metrics are really important. I'm going to now talk about, we're getting now into policies and practices. We just did a very quick look at a variety of good policies and practices, mostly with an HR lens. And now we're talking about workplace disability inclusion, a climate for inclusion. And one of the elements we can look at is disability disclosure. Do people feel comfortable saying that they have a disability if they have a non-obvious disability? It's important because that tells you whether or not they feel that this is a disability-friendly climate for inclusion, workplace inclusion. It also means that people can get accommodations if they need them, if they feel comfortable coming out. There are also regulatory framework reasons why this is important. The federal government has a hiring goal now of 12% of its workforce. It cannot tell if it's how it's doing, can't keep those metrics unless people are disclosing. And US federal contractors of $10,000 or more now have a 7% aspirational goal of their workforce across all job categories who must approximate and show that they're doing affirmative hiring for that reason. So it's important, I just mentioned, because people can, if you can afford people's services and accommodations, and they're enabled to bring their whole selves to work. They're not hiding a part of their identity by not disclosing. It's the supervisor's position in all of this cannot be overemphasized. That is who more often than not we disclose our disability to. At least 60% more people with disabilities are at least 60% more likely to disclose to their supervisor than to HR. And we know that the manager's role is, for that reason, as well as others, very critical to the quality of workplace experiences for people with disabilities. And the motivation that they perceive from the organization is really important. It's important that they see that the organization wants them to be inclusive for people with disabilities because this is a strategic imperative, a business case for the organization, that it's true inclusion interests rather than just legal compliance. They treat people entirely differently from our research feedback across about 6,500 people in 3 or 4 different census studies we did in different companies. We were able to extract this data. Disability disclosure most often occurs, as I mentioned, with the manager or coworkers, and that's why it's really important to educate our supervisors about the criticality of their role. All of us who are in the workplace know how important that role is and how it impacts our ability to perform and feel included, but it appears to be really critical for people with disabilities who have experienced disparateness in the past. I will also say this, that people with disabilities, especially non-obvious disabilities, are less likely to disclose in the front end of the process and more likely to disclose after being hired. That's not true for people with very apparent disabilities who address that more upfront because they might either know that the recruiter or interviewer is going to have questions and they want to mitigate any concerns that might be needless ones, or they want to ask for an accommodation up front. And some of the reasons, we also asked people in a different study, what are the reasons What are the things that would help you feel comfortable disclosing or not? Need for accommodation makes very good sense. About almost 70%, a little less than 2/3 said of having a supportive supervisor relationship. And then other flags in that workplace, like a disability-friendly workplace, like active disability recruiting. People felt like they could come out, knowing of other successes, seeing disability in the diversity statement, or knowing that there was going to be special mentoring programs or advancement programs that the organization was offering for its diverse workforce, and feeling like identifying in that category was important. Far less likely to disclose in these circumstances if they had a risk, they perceived a risk of being fired or not hired on the front end. The employer might focus on the disability, risk of losing their health care that the employer afforded, of limiting their opportunities because of disclosing, fear that the supervisor might not be supportive, or that they would be viewed or treated differently, or that it really wouldn't matter. They would come out and it wouldn't be any advantage to them in any way, perhaps because they didn't need an accommodation or didn't see any specialty support programs or mentoring opportunities that they could avail themselves of. Interestingly, only a little more than a quarter felt that it was a question of privacy, that why they would not disclose. And unfortunately, we have to report from this survey that people experienced reported negative consequences in the longer term, both those with and without obvious disabilities from that disclosure. So creating an environment that encourages disclosure, active recruiting, conducting disability awareness training, having flexible workplace policies, fair systems, accessible workplaces, fostering supportive supervisor-staff relationships, including disability in the diversity statement. These are easy things to do, and some of them certainly easier than others, but that significantly changes the perception and people's willingness to come forward. So in summary, there are disability inclusion considerations throughout the employment process. Supervisors are a critical part of disability inclusive hiring, career development, retention, and workplace inclusion strategies. It's critical to inform and engage partners across internal company structures and resources, and it's helpful to engage relevant community resources as partners in this process. And I'm going to leave you with a wide variety of online tools that my colleagues will have to share after this event, that you are welcome to use if you have interest in this topic and would like to follow up. So we now have time for Q&A. And I will turn it back over to our moderators.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Bruyere. That was a great presentation, a lot of insightful points. I learned a lot about prevalence, about conditions for working, about how to improve the environment, the working environment for persons with disabilities. And we have already some questions in the audience. The first one is a simple question about what exactly do you mean by disability, how it is measured in the US, what is the typology or the elements that are included to reach, 24% of the household have someone with disabilities, or the prevalence rate is over 10% in the active population.
So how are those calculated? Is that the question?
You have a definition and how is it calculated? Yes.
Okay. So each of the U.S. surveys are quite different in terms of how they define disability. The current population survey, I believe, says, do you have an impairment that prevents work? I believe that's the definition there. In the ACS, the American Community Survey, there are 6 very broad categories, and they are, I think, I don't know them off the top of my head, but I will give you an example. They are like a cognitive, which includes mental health and intellectual, I think ambulatory, independent living, meaning your ability to take care of yourself across all your activities of daily living. I think vision and hearing. And I think there might be a sixth one that I'm missing, which may be just other. So each of the surveys are somewhat different. The American Community Survey has these 6 very broad categories.
Great, thank you. The second question is about mental disability or mental health in general that you mentioned a lot in your presentation, and maybe our audience knows a little less about. What are the specificities of welcoming someone with a mental disability in the workplace? What are the concrete ways of adapting the workplace? What can we propose in terms of adaptation, reasonable adaptation for persons with different types of mental disabilities, let's say?
Okay, that's a great question. First of all, let me say there's sort of 2 levels, I think, of considerations that we see with workplaces right now, particularly since the pandemic, but pre-pandemic, I think employers were recognizing that there was a significant part of their workforce who were struggling with mental health issues, anxiety, depression. And so we saw an increase in very proactive communication campaigns for the general workforce about it's okay to, need supports. And here we have an employee assistance program, or your mental health, your benefits include mental health. Don't wait, please proactively seek the support you need. Let us know if you need support. That's sort of generalized good practices that we're increasingly moving into. That I will separate out and say that's wonderful. We need to be doing that. There is also, I think, a different set of considerations, and that is, like I talked about for neurodiversity and for other individuals with disabilities, can we proactively hire and integrate into our workforce individuals who identify as a person with a severe and persistent mental illness? And indeed, there are accommodation practices. It is so unique. I mean, disability is so unique to each person. What's really important, I wouldn't offer a prescription for one size fits all. What's important is to have a dialogue with the person. If you know they have support needs in this area, and find out what works for them. It might be that they need time off for a therapy appointment. Maybe they would come in at 7 in the morning instead of 9 and leave for their appointment at 3:30 rather than at 5 at the end of the day. It could be that has to happen twice a month or 3 times a month. It might be that they need to step away to take medication from their desk, just even to go in a restroom. It could be that they might need stress breaks. It might be that they need a quiet room to go to, or that they need a sound buffer behind them because distractions are particularly anxiety producing in some way. So they don't have to be big changes, but it's important that they are responsive to what the individual's own needs are. And so having that interactive dialogue about what kind of accommodation would be helpful is really important.
Thank you. Another question is about the role of supervisors. You mentioned that the trust with the supervisor was such that that's where eventually persons with disabilities will go for disclosure and not necessarily to human resources. What can we do to improve training of supervisors about, being able to welcome this disclosure and maybe able to, voice some support toward, with human resources for workers with disabilities?
Thank you for that question. It is critically important, and I'm of 2 minds on this. One is, having targeted training around this is what disability inclusion looks like. Here are the kinds of resources we have in our organization. If you don't know how to accommodate, that's absolutely fine. Each person is unique in what their needs might be. Here is a resource in our organization, minimizing the supervisor's anxiety about it by providing good support resources. But I also think that we could be doing a better job of embedding diversity and inclusion issues, including disability, into mainstream management training, so that and so that supervisors are thinking about their role in inclusive behaviors and inclusive teams that covers all kinds of differences, because it's many people with disabilities also have other intersectional identities. And if we talk about ways we might not be fully including women, people of color, LGBTQ and disability, then I think supervisors will be more likely to build behaviors and attitudes that are more generally inclusive, and people with disabilities will get caught up in that change of climate or culture more generally.
Thank you so much. I have a more specific question about multiple sclerosis in the audience, and do we have any data about disclosure of this very specific condition, and what impacts it has on accommodation in this case?
Are you talking about a particular type of disability?
Yes, multiple sclerosis, MS.
With multiple sclerosis.
Yes, sorry.
So the question is, what types of accommodation, and how to facilitate disclosure?
Well, yeah. Do we have any data about all that, particularly about this specific series of conditions, which is not visible necessarily? And
right. Well, if you want to, people want to email me, they can. Each is so different, and there are good resources on multiple sclerosis. The Multiple Sclerosis Association itself has an excellent collection of information about accommodations in the workplace. We have some. There is a rehabilitation research and training center on multiple sclerosis at the University of Washington. And since sometimes people, this condition is exacerbated over time, sometimes people don't ask right away for what they need, but often it might be visual problems, it might be mobility problems for people, it could be cognitive issues. So it really depends on the way it manifests in the individual, how the employer might have to accommodate.
Okay, thank you. And the last question, because it's almost time. So for someone who is expanding their workforce development program for young adults to include individuals with a variety of disabilities, what would be concrete tips you could give us to do that?
If you're developing like an internship program, is that what I'm hearing? If they were an employment program that would include people with disabilities and youth. I heard the word youth, right? Yeah. So if you are, many employers, of course, are affirmatively hiring young people all the time. And I would say, first of all, if you are looking to where to find them, go to generically two broad sources. Whatever universities you're going to now to get your talent, instead of just going to the department with your engineers or computer scientists or whatever the degree is you're looking for, also look to the Students with Disabilities Services and flag your positions there, because that is often where young people have registered, and those who need accommodations, it is far more likely that you'll be able to find this special group there and work with community organizations that are sourcing talent. Every community has them. And it's important to look for them and look for ones who have the kind of talent with the kinds of skills that you're looking for, or are willing to work with you as a company to skill up these recruits to meet the levels of qualifications that you need. And I'll pause there because I know we're at time.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Janet. I let you the floor.
Thank you. Susanne, thank you so much for an amazing talk and all the resources that you left our audience with. I know we just scratched the surface and you gave them so much. We have posted the resources on the on-demand part of the Open Classroom website. So thank you for that. Appreciate you spending this time with us. Jean-Francois, as always, thank you so much for a beautiful job moderating. I want to thank Genevieve for interpretation services. We really appreciate it. To the audience, thanks for hanging in with us. Great questions. Hope to see you again at another program very soon. And everybody, please stay healthy and safe out there. Goodbye and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. Bye.